And the second speaker, the last speaker before tea, is Tom Chivers. Tom's important book, I don't know if you're going to mention it, on London itself, is again very revealing of the different environments and the different periods in London. I'm glad you could come along today, Tom, and if you'd like to come now, please do.
Thank you very much, Harvey. I promise to speak into the microphone. I don't want to get any trouble, as you have repeatedly been getting into. Right, here's the clicker. Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to speak for the Lammas Conference, and I was in particular want to thank John for inviting me, not least because John, like me, is a Crystal Palace fan. I'm not an archaeologist, apologies, so I'm just going to start with a very brief overview of who I am, if I'm not an archaeologist. Let's see if this works. There we go. So I was born in South London, so I'm a proper Palace fan, and I did a BA in literature, medieval literature, followed by about 15 years working in publishing and the performing arts. I used to run a small arts company. And I've always also had a kind of creative writing practice, initially as a poet and latterly as a sort of non-fiction writer. And I also used to create site-specific audio and walking performances, such as this one. Many of you may recognise this passage. I think this is Token House Yard in the City of London during one of the audio pieces that I made down the Lost River Walbrook. And as Harvey very kindly mentioned, I published a couple of years ago a book called London Clay, which is a bit of a mishmash. The Financial Times called it A Meditation on Landscape, Cities, Reportage and Memoir. And in fact, Harvey appears twice in the book. Once regarding his excavation of a Roman road in or near Old Ford, and the other is to do with the Rose Playhouse. My late mother was one of the people who campaigned to save the Rose back in the 80s. She was a school teacher and forced her sixth formers to chain themselves to the fences. Jane also appears in the book, so that's about as close to archaeology as I get. Except for that I began mudlarking in 2020. For me, it was very much a lockdown activity. I have small children and I was desperate to get out of the house. So the foreshore became kind of like the back garden, or the front garden, actually. And I've been taking it quite seriously ever since. And then in 2022, an opportunity came up to study for a PhD in mudlarking, which when I announce that fact, people usually laugh. So I'm kind of taking some comfort from the fact that you didn't. But that is what I'm doing at the moment. And a brief intro to the project. It's a collaborative doctoral award funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It's hosted by Queen Mary, University of London, in the Geography Department, which is why I'm wearing contour lines on my shirt. But with Museum of London Archaeology. It's a 4-year project ending next year, and my supervisors are Alistair Owens, Ed Legan, Claire Harris, who you're going to be hearing from very soon, and Kat Gibbs. And the project is to investigate contemporary mudlarking on the Thames Foreshore, very simply, utilising methods from anthropology, archaeology, history, and cultural geography. And informed by various theorists, some of whose names you might recognise. It's the first significant academic research on contemporary mudlarking, which again gives me comfort, because even if my work is rubbish, it's the first. So I've got that in my favour. My methodology, very simply, starting with a review of existing literature and data on mudlarking, of which there isn't very much, although of course there's lots of archaeological work on the foreshore. Monitoring physical change and human use. I've been working on a field site in Rotherhithe, conveniently right next to where I live, where I've been working over a year doing weekly visits and monitoring erosion and deposition. Interviews with stakeholders such as the Port of London and the museum. An online survey of mudlarks and the kind of the biggie really, which is go along interviews with mudlarks. So I've been going along and actually mudlarking with a group of about 20 mudlarks. And the thesis that I am going to produce, I'm halfway through producing, begins with a chapter on place, to try and understand the geography of the foreshore, both physically and culturally. Secondly, zooming in, focusing on the people who are doing it, the mudlarks themselves. Then looking at the objects, not necessarily from an archaeological perspective, but more thinking about the mudlarks' affective or emotional relationship with the objects they find. Then a chapter in which I propose mudlarking as a form of what I'm currently calling counter-heritage. And then finally a chapter on the future. I'm not quite sure what that's going to be yet. So this paper that I'm going to read is drawn from the second chapter of the thesis, which uses the results of the interviews with mudlarks to better understand the techniques and strategies they deploy and their relationship to the foreshore as a meaningful and multi-sensory landscape, to attain what anthropologist Tim Ingold calls a dwelling perspective. My research is broadly informed by the tradition of phenomenology, a word that I can only just pronounce, otherwise known as the philosophy of lived experience. And it's especially interested in the idea of embodiment, or what Thomas Chordash calls the somatic mode of attention. For mudlarks, this world of ephemeral surfaces and objects that Pamela's so brilliantly described, forever moving between land and water, is also mediated through a particular set of temporal conditions. So at the end of this paper, I want to explore how mudlarks perceive the passing of time while in the flow of their activity. First, though, let's begin with a brief account of my very first fieldwork visit with a mudlark just north of Vauxhall Bridge at Millbank, as you can see in the photo. It was early evening, mid-September, traffic was light, and there were few pedestrians about. Behind me was a terrace of Regency-style houses with gleaming white stucco facades. As I looked across the river, I could make out the postmodernist ziggurat of the MI6 headquarters, and beyond it, the high-rise towers of the new Vauxhall. The river was already low, the ebb tide flowing out towards the estuary. Mudlark Mark Iglesias invited me to pull myself up onto the concrete parapet of the embankment wall. From here, lying in a prone position, I could see a metal ladder attached to the river side of the wall. I hauled my legs over, tested the first rung with my foot, and then descended the ladder carefully before dropping onto the rubble surface below. A few minutes later, Mark dropped down too. The foreshore stretched 50 feet or so out to the water's edge. It was dark, empty, and unsurveyed, and my heart was racing. The descent at Millbank was a leap into the literal dark. Beyond and below the sodium glare of the city, night arrives early on the foreshore here. Over the next 3 hours, Mark and I journeyed west along the river in complete isolation, save for 2 appearances: a pair of kayakers heading silently upstream, and the ghostly boot prints of a mysterious detectorist named Vad, who Mark insisted was probably around here somewhere. Our head torches provided the only light as we searched the sand and rubble on our hands and knees, picked our way across abandoned barge beds, and explored the choked-up mouths of Victorian sewers. On another occasion, another Mark Sowden, who's in the audience today, invited me to join him on his habitual journey from Liverpool Street to the foreshore at Dowgate. This 15-minute walk through the capital's historic core is, for Mark, a vital exercise in preparing his mind and body for the foreshore. I'm starting to tune in, he told me, and starting to pick out features, road layouts that help me start that process of time travel. As you feel the gravity of the river, you get to places where you actually start to go downhill, or you're actually being pulled. Mark conceives of the foreshore not as an entirely separate domain, but as inextricably connected to the historic city through which it's approached. As we walked, Mark consulted a map of Roman London in order to orient himself in space and make sense of the relationship between historic riverside structures and the objects he's retrieved from the foreshore. The journey was not only an intellectual and imaginative process, it was also an embodied experience. It was about feeling the pavement underfoot and connecting to the material presence of the city through physical contact. Tim Ingold argues that it is surely through our feet in contact with the ground that we are most fundamentally and continually in touch with our surroundings. I propose that it's precisely through contact with the ground that mudlarks develop a rich knowledge and appreciation of the landscape of the Thames Foreshore. Almost all the mudlarks I interviewed reported the importance of physical contact. Every time my feet touched down on the foreshore, Mark Iglesias told me, it's just like I can breathe. For Heather Stevens, it's just the whole element of connecting with the foreshore, touching some mud, that there's a spiritual connection. With its unstable surfaces and heterogeneous materiality, the foreshore is a place which encourages a different kind of connection to the ground, to the conventional experience of the urban environment. The foreshore demands that we pay attention to our bodies as we move. As mudlark Angela Cheapsomsong told me, being on the foreshore is quite good for your body because you're stretching a bit more than you do in your normal day. When it's rocky, especially if you're in wellies, if you walk on the stones, you get that sort of acupuncture massage in the arches of your feet. For Charlie Dixon, who's also in the audience today, mudlarking is like exercise. It's good for you. The complex, irregular landscape offers him physical challenge and relief from lower back pain. I contort myself, he told me, in some pretty weird positions to get under rocks. Alessio Ceccioni even reported the growth of calluses on his hands and suggested that mudlarking can completely change the shape of your posture. You build your core without thinking. For Liz Anderson, the river is simply the best medicine, and she even continued mudlarking during treatment for cancer. One participant, Carrie Ann Tuff, reported that squatting on the foreshore has helped her to recover from chronic pain. I'm not a doctor, she told me, but that's the one thing that mudlarking has done for me, is made my knee so much better. The experiences of Angela, Charlie, Alessio, Liz, and Carrie Ann are substantiated by data collected from a wider group of mudlarks. Over 3/4 of respondents to my online survey reported that mudlarking improves their physical health, with an even higher proportion, 91%, reporting improvements to their mental health. Of course, the division of physical and mental here is necessarily reductive. Embodied practices are always affective, and affective states always embodied. As Carrie Ann told me, sometimes I even lay down on this thing and have a little meditate, on my back like that. Especially in the summer, it's lovely when the sun's beating down on you. During the course of my study, I observed participants engaging in a wide range of physical actions. These movements include walking, bending, kneeling, crouching, squatting, scraping, digging, raking, touching, and holding. While they might have appeared at first glance to be instinctive, even somewhat primitive, these actions were, I suggest, highly skilled and carefully coordinated techniques deployed in response to the particular conditions of the landscape unfolding before them. For example, areas of shingle and sand tended to be searched by conventional field walking, whereas patches of eroding mud invited closer inspection through kneeling, crouching, or the use of tools. The mudlark's actions were further determined by the regulatory conditions of the area being searched. In certain parts of the foreshore, practices such as digging and scraping are forbidden, and eyes-only techniques must be used. On a cold weekday morning in November, I joined Mark Sowden to search an area known as the Roman Hole. This unassuming site lies at a low point in the foreshore, which is rapidly eroding, and has in recent years produced a large quantity of small finds. Despite its central location, the hole is relatively inaccessible to casual walkers. After descending the river stairs, you must first cross an area of rubble before clambering up the western edge of a large dilapidated camp shed. From here, it is a few minutes' walk across a firm surface of gravel and sand to reach the hole. But such is the popularity of this site with mudlarks, on the day I visited, there were already 6 people working the tide line by 8 a.m. The Roman Hole lies within a protected stretch where all surface disturbance and digging is prohibited, to standard permit holders at least. When Mark and I visited, all the mudlarks were searching using their eyes only. The mudlarks were tightly grouped at the edge of the water, where the ebb tide was slowly revealing a patch of fine gravel and sand, no more than 30 metres across. As the water receded, lower ground could be accessed, although on the day in question, the water level would not drop low enough for them to reach the bottom of the hole. Nor was it low enough for anyone to cross a narrow strip of gravel to reach an area of higher ground known as the island, although one mudlark did attempt to cross but almost fell in. The most common positions observed at the Roman Hole were standing, bending, and kneeling on all fours. Mark preferred to stand with his head slightly bent down to inspect the surface. When standing straight, he might have his hands behind his back, and when bending down, he might rest his hands on his knees. As Mark moved slowly across the site, he was careful to avoid entering the personal space of other mudlarks, although this was sometimes unavoidable. The whole operation appeared from a distance as an elaborately choreographed dance, mostly performed in complete silence with the occasional break for conversation or to inspect finds. When another mudlark appeared over the brow of the camp shed, Mark commented, "We're at capacity, the nightclub can't take any more." Later, he characterized the mudlarks at the Roman Hole as various species of birds involved in what he called weird feeding behavior, dubbing one sharp-eyed mudlark a peregrine hawk, definitely, and himself a pigeon or crow. When Mark found an especially promising patch of ground, he would set his feet wider apart and bend from the waist to get a closer look, with his hands available to pick out small finds. This arrangement of body and limbs seemed perfectly adapted to the conditions of searching the Roman Hole. As the tide approached its lowest point, Mark established a position on the tide line with his back to the river and his feet in the water. In this way, he was able to observe any tiny objects being washed up onto the foreshore by the wakes of passing boats, while remaining stable in the water. The surface acted as a kind of trap. As an environment for searching, it was constantly, if imperceptibly, changing in relation to the river. "This is it," Mark told me. "This is the dynamic of this place. You always check the waves, check to see if anything's come." Here at the Roman Hole, the hydrodynamics of the Thames are working in Mudlark's favour, revealing an array of objects from London's past as a Roman colonia, including coins, dress accessories, pottery, and tiny intaglios, engraved gemstones once set into rings. Mark is one of the regular Mudlarks here, who are, collectively, maintaining an unofficial watching brief. The amount of erosion that's happening here means that we're on kind of borrowed time to search, he told me. Mark showed me a line of modern rubble and concrete walls which are being aggressively undercut. These, he explained, indicate the former height of the camp shed, over 6 feet higher than today. In some places, he pointed out a shelly layer of the ground, which he believes indicates that the foreshore has dropped even below the level of Roman deposition to expose original riverbank. For Mark, the intense erosion is a mixed blessing, but there are still objects to find. The good stuff is being washed in from further out there, he remarked. During field work with Thames mudlarks, I came to learn the fundamental importance of looking within their practice. The process of developing visual skill to identify objects is often expressed as getting your eye in, but the mechanics behind it are rarely considered and have as much to do with the brain as they do with the eyes. It's certainly not just a matter of good eyesight. As Angela remarked, mudlarking trains the brain to re-see. For her, a visit to the foreshore allows her to get my eyes back after being in the real world. For Heather, that process begins by searching on her hands and knees for pins. I always start with dress pins, she told me, which kind of tunes my eyes in. Later, she used a metaphor from military radar to describe how she was locking in to objects. In both examples, visual perception is conceptualized not as a passive state of reception, but as an active, intentional operation. The essence of perception, wrote James J. Gibson, is selective attention to something important. But how do mudlarks deploy this selective attention in such a complex optic array as the Thames Foreshore? We might begin by considering what I'd call the strangeness of objects. To spot a coin or a key or a pin sitting on the surface of fine silt is to perceive something that doesn't belong there, to identify certain regularities of form within a complex matrix of natural material. As Laura Makelem has written, Mother Nature rarely makes perfectly straight lines or circles, and as the eye becomes practiced, imperfections and patterns start to stand out. Makelem's methodology was shared by many of my participants. Every time I come down, explained Angela, I always go circular and round, and I say that in my head. Pipe bowls, musket balls, grape shot, and a coin. Tim Miller characterized the foreshore as higgledy-piggledy and told me, you see this edge or a clean line in some way and your eye is naturally drawn to that. For a skilled mudlark, an object of regular form may be identified even when perceived partially, when it's concealed behind a rock or embedded in mud, or from a slant perspective from which it appears skewed or foreshortened. It is the detection of borders between objects and their surrounding environments rather than the perception of whole entities that enables the discovery of things on the foreshore. Indeed, for Mark Sowden, it is the border or edge which gives an object its identity, its objectness, even when found in degraded or fragmentary state. A true object, Mark told me, has definition, edges. Objects are things that have enough definition that you can pick them up. No single mudlark looks in precisely the same way. Instead, each employs their perceptive capabilities in ways determined by prior experience and specialist interests. Some mudlarks have an eye for worked flint, others for clay pipes, beads, or garnets. Sometimes a mudlark's eye will have been influenced by another practice, such as fossil hunting or metal detecting, but usually it's determined by the experience of the foreshore. Once you've found an object type, it becomes easier to identify the same form, colour, or texture again. For some specialist mudlarks, their perceptive capacities become attuned to one object type to the exclusion of others. As Riccardo Lizola told me while searching in Vauxhall, once I started finding the flint, I couldn't see anything else. During fieldwork, I began to wonder whether Tim Ingold's theory of thinking in movement might be applied to the experiences of mudlarks navigating the intertidal landscape. It is by walking along from place to place, Ingold contends, that we come to know what we do. To what extent then might mudlarks be characterized in Ingold's terminology as wayfarers who negotiate or improvise a passage as they go along? At Southwark, Alessio showed me how thousands of dumped roof tiles had collected under Blackfriars Bridge, forming a series of deposition lines parallel to the river. What I tend to do is look for the lines, Heather told me, and it tends to go in weight order. I always slow down for a bone line, explained J.R. Carpenter. Dice often settle at a bone line. And at Battersea, I followed Liz along what she called ribbons of possible pottery. These are just a handful of the many ways in which mudlarks use their experience to interpret or read the landscape. What might appear to the outsider as a chaotic matrix of randomly distributed materials is the result of physical and hydrodynamic principles governing the complex interactions between objects, surfaces, and water flow. It is these interactions that mudlarks invoke when they talk of erosion lines, patches, pockets, ribbons, waves, or veins. Metal objects like coins and buttons, for example, tend to gather at low points on the foreshore, either on the surface or below a shallow covering of sand or fine gravel. Objects that float, such as bone and clay pipe, can be washed in on waves and thus form deposition lines with other low-density materials. Patches of productive mud appear and disappear according to where the sediment has been removed, and this is determined both by the complex currents and tidal rhythms of the river, as well as by disturbance caused by passing vessels, as Pamela was talking about. Research participants often search for objects at the convergence of two or more sediment types, or where the elevation angle of the foreshore changes abruptly. I call these zones of transition, and they operate in a similar way to geological strata. At the point of contact between formations, things flow out from within. Accordingly, those stretches of foreshore with greater diversity of sediment type and topography tend to be more productive for finding objects. It is its material heterogeneity that makes the foreshore such a valuable landscape for mudlarks. For some, the arrangement of the landscape into patches, ribbons, veins, etc., is not merely the means to an end, but provides intrinsic interest and sensory delight. During our visit to the North Bank, J.R. Carpenter appeared to be less interested in talking about the objects she'd found than in the systems which produce the material environment of the foreshore, the mechanics of the river flowing and moving stuff around. As we traversed the rugged landscape near the Roman Hole, J.R. repeatedly stopped to inspect patches of ground where the tide had gathered small objects such as lead shot, garnets and pins into ephemeral assemblages, or what she called situations of the amassed. In his analysis of sites of industrial ruin, Tim Edensaw emphasizes the disordered arrangement of the material things that populate them, as well as the movements of people moving through these seemingly empty landscapes. Inside ruins, he writes, objects, textures, and fragments fall out of their previously assigned contexts to recombine like elements in dreams. This surely holds true for the Thames Foreshore. And yet the experienced mudlark knows where and how to look, precisely because of the logical arrangement of things by the river, a complex organizing system that is largely concealed to others. For the foreshore is neither ordered nor disordered, but both. The skill of the mudlark is to sit with the discomfort of this paradox, to develop rational strategies for searching while remaining open to chance, understanding the foreshore as a landscape of legible patterns as well as surprise, contingency, and misrule. I spoke at the beginning of this paper about, have I got that right? There we go. About the experience of descending the river wall, crossing from everyday urban life into the alternate reality of the foreshore. This feeling of otherness can be thought of as both temporal as well as spatial. Tim Edensaw characterizes sites of urban ruin as temporally divergent, inviting those who explore them to slow down and stop, to opt out of the usual flow of time. For mudlarks, this altered temporality is a significant motivating factor. Time was mentioned again and again by the mudlarks who responded to my survey. Quality time, free time, me time, my time, the time in my head, the most special time I spend by myself. The foreshore was characterized as a source of personal freedom and connection to self, an opportunity to disconnect for a few hours from the madness of the modern world, as one person put it. But it would not be accurate to think of the foreshore as existing without or outside of time, but instead as a kind of temporal empty space. Instead, in this diverse landscape, objects, materials, and living things move along and within a multitude of contrasting timescales, producing what Anna Singh calls temporal polyphony, a music of interwoven rhythms. On a single stretch of foreshore, a mudlark might encounter a dozen silvery shrimp larvae and a juvenile eel wriggling in the shallows beneath the rubble of houses demolished during the Blitz, a plastic bottle of Lucozade Sport scudding along the foreshore to rest in the crook of an eroding ship timber on which a colony of bright green algae have settled, and the vast, slow movement of sediment of all kinds in which he or she might find just there a sherd of decorated Samian ware or the fossil of an echinoid formed in London clay in the early Eocene. And this polyphony is not only temporal, but spatial too. The eel has already travelled 4,000 miles from its spawning grounds in the Sargasso Sea, the Samian ware from the potteries of central Gaul. Even the bottle of Lucozade Sport has its own geographical life cycle, moving, as Randa Katchev has demonstrated, along a variety of human-mediated pathways before entering the river. The popular characterisation of mudlarking as time travel thus gives way in this reading to a more nuanced appreciation of the spatio-temporal patterns of the foreshore as endlessly polyrhythmic. Ivor Noel Hume's arresting image of hands linking across what he calls the void of time only brushes the surface of the mudlark's complex entanglements with temporality. Perhaps rather than reaching across a void, the mudlark finds themselves instead immersed within the flows of time, caught up in its intricate whirls and eddies. The apparently arbitrary reordering of historical objects and materials on the foreshore, the disjointed and dynamic stratigraphies, the endlessly complex patterns of deposition and redeposition speak against normative chronologies of history. This is an understanding of time not as linear progression, with the mudlark jumping back and forth across an ordered sequence of events, but instead as recursive and haunting, as Matthew Wolfmeyer suggests, the mudlark's practice revealing the essential co-presence of all time and all history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. A lot, obviously, of very interesting information. My own experience of foreshores, I have to say, is very limited, and it comes from the area of North Southwark, where what's most common is erosion and deposition. But we do have one mudlark find which came up very close to Winchester Palace, where clearly the Roman buildings have been eroded into the river. And on the book in honour of Hugh Chapman that we wrote now more than 20 years ago, that find, which was essentially it was an intaglio with 4 sailors sitting within a boat, which is actually very similar to the Aris medallion and the way often Rome illustrated seaborne activity. But it came in exactly the right place. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if that was an intaglio washed out from what may well have been a naval building. It certainly had Classis Britannica tiles on it. So there is a link, and there can be a discovery made that way, which fits very well, certainly in North Southwark, with the archaeological sites, or what's left of them, behind. Anyway, it's a very interesting and I'm sure a very thought-provoking session. And I'm sure plenty of questions are going to follow for you, Tom, during the tea break. But thank you very much. We'll let everybody go now, have their tea, and come back for the last 2 sessions of the afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.